The Game Awards has given out the Best Independent Game Award every year since 2014. That's 11 winners so far. Some of them changed the way we think about video games. Some of them made it clear that there's no real limit to what a single person can do with a laptop and enough soberness. And at least one of them sparked a real debate about whether the category still means anything. Let's go through them together. The very first one was Shovel Knight. This game was a huge success, and I think the reason is that it created a kind of connection between the indie world and retro gaming. The team at Yacht Club went 5 months without paying themselves to finish it. They funded it on Kickstarter, raised about $300,000. But once they ran the actual numbers on salaries, they realized it wasn't enough. So they just didn't pay themselves for a while. And they shipped it anyway. Shovel Knight sold about 180,000 copies in its first month. By 2018, it had crossed 2 million games sold. There was a period in video games where the industry made a very sharp turn from 2D to 3D. I think around the time the PlayStation arrived, because everyone was convinced that better graphics meant more players. Shovel Knight proved that people were still in love with old NES games, and it was made by people who clearly loved NES games. This next winner is a bit strange because I wouldn't consider it indie today. Rocket League won in 2015, and then within a few years was bought by Epic Games. Yes, that Epic Games. So it started indie and didn't stay that way. Fine, nothing wrong with that, but it's a little odd to look at the 2015 nominees list and see a winner that now belongs to one of the biggest companies in the industry. And let me make that sound even stranger. That same year, Undertale came out, which then became one of the most discussed games of its entire era. Undertale had a massive cultural impact, and we still talk about it today. Rocket League is fantastic. Soccer with cars is a genius idea. But if you're thinking about the indie game from that year that people are still arguing about and writing essays about in 2025 or 26, I don't think there's really a debate. That's Undertale. This one I can agree with the award. Inside is played as follow-up to Limbo, but not like Limbo 2. I'd actually call it more of a spin-off of Limbo in terms of atmosphere and gameplay, but noticeably better. Sort of like Better Call Saul compared to Breaking Bad. Yeah, I know. It's a dark puzzle platformer where you're running from something that honestly I wouldn't even know how to describe. Let's say it's you against the system around you. And the ending, I've mentioned it in other videos, is one of those moments where a game does something that you can't really explain to someone who hasn't played it, because you can't fully explain it to yourself. So yes, a game you can barely describe, but crystal clear in how it plays, won that year. The competition included Firewatch, which deserved just as much attention. Firewatch is beautiful, melancholy, and one of the best uses of the Wyoming summer landscape I've seen in a video game. The Moldenhauer brothers, Chad and Jared, remortgaged their house to finish this game. They started working on it around 2010, and it came out in September 2017. 7 years from the beginning. That's a long time to work on one thing, especially when you've bet your house on it. What made CUPHEAD insane to build is that every single frame of animation was drawn by hand in the 1930s rubber hose style. I picture this guy sitting down to draw on paper and then scan it, which is pure madness. The result looks like a cartoon from the 30s, but plays like one of the hardest games I've ever played. CUPHEAD sold 2 million copies in the first 2 weeks. When you think about it, that's something incredible. These people mortgaged their home to make this game. They took an enormous risk. Those years of uncertainty of mortgages and delays exist outside the award story. The award is a trophy. It doesn't cover the real cost of getting there. Celeste is a pure platformer with a pixel art style. It is also very clearly a game about anxiety and depression, even though it never uses those words. You feel them in how the mechanics work, in what the game asks of you, in how it responds when you fail. It was made by Maddie Thorson and Noel Barry, mostly just the two of them with a bit of help. It came out in January 2018. The prototype, Celeste Classic, had been made in 4 days at a game jam. The full game took about 2 years. Celeste won the Best Independent Game in 2018, and it absolutely deserved it. It was also nominated for Game of the Year, which is remarkable for an indie game with 2 main developers. One thing worth saying, Celeste has one of the best accessibility features I've seen in any game. Assist mode lets you modify almost every variable, from your speed to full invisibility, without any judgment. The game just lets you decide how much challenge you want. That's rarer than it should be. The game became also important for a reason outside its design. In 2021, Maddie Thorson wrote publicly about being a trans woman and reflected on how Madeline, the player character, had been part of that personal journey. The game people thought was about climbing a mountain turned out to be also something about much more personal than anyone outside the studio knew at the time. Let's spend a bit more time on this one. Disco Elysium was developed by Zaum, an Estonian studio. The lead writer, Robert Kurvitz, had spent years building a tabletop RPG world called Elysium with his friends. Then he wrote a novel set in that world. The novel didn't work well. He went through some kind of depression, and then his friends convinced him to turn it into a video game. The team was made up mostly of writers with no experience in game development. We can safely say that most of them had zero background in game design, so they were a bit unprepared, which is probably why development ended up taking about 5 years. Disco Elysium is an RPG with no combat. You play as a detective with total amnesia, alone in a crumbling coastal district, trying to solve a murder while your own brain argues with you. You have 24 internal voices representing different psychological drives, and they interject constantly, sometimes helping, sometimes not. You can fail skill checks for being too stupid, too empathic, or too ideologically rigid. The game has a political worldview, a specific one actually, and it doesn't hide it. It won 4 awards at the Game Awards 2019 and went on to sell more than 5 million copies. There's also the story of what happened afterward, internal conflicts that led Kurvitz and several key writers to leave or be pushed out around 2021. I'm genuinely not sure how all of that will end up affecting, or maybe not affecting, Zaum's new game, Zero Operates. So Hades won it in 2020, and that was the right call. I think most people agreed. Supergiant Games is a studio in San Francisco, based in San Francisco. They had already made Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre, all well regarded. But Hades was different. It took years to find the right formula, and they did it in early access with players watching the game being built in real time. Hades is a roguelike set in Greek mythology where you play as Zagreus, the son of Hades, trying to escape the underworld. The narrative structure is built around repetition. Every time you die, you go back to the start. But every time you go back, the story moves forward. Your relationships with the gods change, your weapons change, the house you live in changes. It's one of the most satisfying designs I've seen in any game, in the sense that nothing feels wasted. It also has one of the best casts of characters of recent years and a soundtrack that still holds up. Hades became the first video game to win a Hugo Award. Kena: Bridge of Spirits is a beautiful action-adventure game developed by Amber Lab, a studio that had previously made animated shorts and commercials. The game looks extraordinary. The animations are fluid and expressive in a way that many much larger studios don't manage to achieve. It was the first game of this studio. It won Best Independent Game in 2021, and among the nominees there was also Inscription. In the end, Kena won, with some controversy around it. My feeling is that it was actually the right result, because it's an impressive first game from a studio clearly full of talent. But Inscription was doing something that probably only gets attempted once or twice per decade, and it lost to the prettier game. That's what awards do sometimes. Just for the record, at the Game Developers' Choice Awards and the Independent Games Festival the following year, Inscription won Game of the Year. So Kena won the Game Awards, Inscription won everything else. So this one is the famous cat game that everyone talks about. You play as a cat in a post-apocalyptic city populated by robots who have forgotten what humans were. You solve puzzles, you knock things off shelves, like cats do. Stray was made by Blue 12 Studio, a team in Montpellier, France. Most of the team had come from Ubisoft. It was published by Annapurna Interactive, who have been behind some of the most interesting indie games of this era. Stray won Best Independent Game and also made it into the main Game of the Year category alongside Elden Ring and God of War Ragnarok. This is remarkable for an indie game. I'm not disputing that Stray deserved recognition, but I do think it's worth mentioning Immortality. Immortality is one of the most formally inventive games ever made. You're searching through a film archive trying to figure out what happened to a woman, and the answer comes from rewinding moments and looking at what's happening in the background. I'll just say it deserved more, that's all. Sea of Stars is a turn-based RPG in the style of classic 16-bit JRPGs, made by Sabotage Studio, the same team behind The Messenger. It's extremely well made and clearly a love letter to the era of Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. I have less to say about this one. Sea of Stars is a very good game. It's also, in some ways, a very polished recreation of something old rather than something new. The more interesting story from 2023 might actually be the games that weren't nominated. There were several releases that year that felt like they were pushing in genuinely new directions, and the category ended up rewarding a very refined, very comfortable RPG. This is not wrong, but just a bit surprising. So I've talked about this one in a previous video, but it's worth going through the most interesting parts again. Local Thunk is a solo developer who was working in IT. He spent 2.5 years making a card game in his spare time, using an engine called Löwe that almost nobody uses for commercial releases. He published the Steam page and told people his expectation was to sell maybe 10 copies, and then go back to the IT job. BALATRO sold 1 million copies in its first month. When it won Best Independent Game in 2024, it was at 3.5 million copies sold. BALATRO is a poker-themed roguelike deck builder. The premise is that you're playing poker, but the rules keep bending. You buy jokers and modify scoring. You have tarot cards that change your deck. The hand that scored 0 points 20 minutes ago suddenly scores in the millions after you've set up the right combination. It's the most one more round game I've encountered in years. Local Thunk, the anonymous developer, apparently doesn't quite know what to do with the success. He bought a house with his partner. He didn't change much else. Honestly, that's how indie developers live. That's what we are. We are simple people. And that's the whole story. One person makes a weird card game alone, expects almost nothing, and it becomes one of the defining games of 2024. And then 2025 happened, and honestly, we could debate a lot of things here. First among them, can a game with a budget of over $10 million really be called indie? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe not. Who am I to tell? Expedition 33 won Best Independent Game at the Game Awards 2025. It won 9 awards in total, the record in TGA history. It received 30 nominations, also a record surpassing The Last of Us Part 2. It was made by Sandfall Interactive, a French studio of around 30 developers, many of them ex-Ubisoft. At this point, I question myself how many people left Ubisoft. Every time I talk about the game, someone comes from Ubisoft. Expedition 33 is a very large-looking game, and to be fair, it's worth mentioning that the studio hired hundreds of contractors on top of the core team. I think that's exactly where the controversy comes from. The game was also published by CLAIR Interactive, which is not a small publisher. We can fairly say that the doubts about whether it's actually indie are completely legitimate, because we're talking about a game made by a studio with a very high budget, a serious publisher, and a large number of people involved. So, what do you think? Is it indie or is it not indie? And also let me know in the comments which winner you think most deserved it and which one you think got it wrong. I have some opinions and I suspect you do too. Thanks for watching.